Wringer Chapter 22. Tree stumping had become popular among other school kids. Other boys, noticing what fun Palmer LaRue and his friends were having, decided this was something they could play too. So they began picking out girls to tree stump to and from school. Occasionally, a tree stump got swatted by a girl's book bag, but for the most part, the girls also found it to be fun. And before long, they were tree stumping the boys. Dorothy Gruzik, of course, being the exception. Beans began to notice. For a while it had been enough just to bother Dorothy Gruzik, enough to hear the laughter of himself and his pals. Now he wanted more. He wanted something from Dorothy. He wanted her to scream, or laugh, or cry, or kick, or sling a book bag, or even scowl. A good scowl, that would do for starters. Anything but ignore them. For that's what Dorothy did. Except to walk around them when they planted themselves in front of her, she in no way acknowledged their existence. She did not even look at them. One day after school, determined to change this, Beans ordered the guys to meet her right at the school door and to tree stump her, if necessary, every step of the way to her own front door. They did. Not once did she look at them. Nor did she make it harder for them. She could have taken shortcuts through people's yards. She could have gone into a store here, a friend's house there, but she did not. Beans began to do more. Instead of just standing stiff and stump-like in front of her, he waggled his arms and legs. He rolled his eyes and wiggled his ears. He stretched his lips to show every one of his multicolored teeth. He grunted and bellowed and snorted and just plain screamed in her face. He scooped a plastic spoonful of baked beans from his can and dumped it on her shoe. The guys and the other kids howled with laughter. Palmer's stomach hurt. He laughed so hard. That Beans! He looked like a puppet on strings, herky-jerking in front of Dorothy, his head wobbling, even his ankles. What a clown! Dorothy never flinched. She never looked. On a windy day, Beans swatted her books away, making papers fly, so she had to go chasing them. Another day, he snatched away her floppy red hat and put it on his own head and did his goofy flailing dance in front of her. The sidewalks erupted in laughter. Even passing cars slowed down. Dorothy did not crack a smile. She did not step aside. She did not step back. She did nothing. She did not even leave the hat at home the next day. In the following days, Beans zeroed in on the hat. He sent it flying across the street. He tossed it into a dumpster. He hung it from a car's antenna. He tacked it to a telephone pole. He wiped a window with it. For Muddo, Henry, and Palmer, who by now were strictly spectators, this was a daily after-school show. Each morning the hat was a little grayer, a little less red, and just as firmly on Dorothy's head. Muddo said in amazement, "I think she likes torture." Beans smoldered. The last thing Beans did was the simplest of all. It happened on a Friday afternoon. As usual, he intercepted Dorothy on the way home, but this time he not only stepped in front of her, he closed in. He closed in until there was barely a paper's width of space between their noses. No monkey shines this time, no funny faces. His jaw hard, his eyes burning, he stared unblinking into eyes a mere inch away and dared them not to see him. Dared her not to smell his baked bean breath. All movement, all laughter on the sidewalk stopped. The boy and the girl stood like that for what seemed like hours. So close that at a distance it seemed like they might be kissing. And to those nearby, and finally to Beans himself, it became clear that even now, even this close, still, she would not look at him. And then she did it. She spoke. But the person she spoke to was not Beans. It was Palmer LaRue. She took one step back from Beans and walked straight over to Palmer and stood squarely in front of him and said, "Why are you doing this to me?" And just like that, the girl in the red coat and floppy hat was no longer a target. She was Dorothy. There were tears in her eyes, and she was saying to him, not to anyone else, but to him, to Palmer. Why are you doing this to me? And he knew that through these last weeks she'd been hurting after all, and that it had been himself, not Beans, who had hurt her the most. She turned away then, not bothering to wipe her eyes, and walked home. The next day Nipper failed to return. As usual, the first thing Palmer did after closing his door was to look out the window. Usually what he saw was Nipper's silhouette, a clear black cutout on the golden sunlit shade. This time there was only the shade, like an empty movie screen. Well, it happened before. Sometimes Palmer was the first to get home. He shot baskets with his Nerf ball, glancing at the window after every shot, listening for taps on the pane. With every passing moment he became convinced something was wrong, that it was not an ordinary delay. In a way more felt than not, he sensed a connection between Nipper's absence and Dorothy's words, which had been haunting him without let up. He raised the shade, raised the window, looked out. No Nipper. Not on the roof, not in the sky, and the sun was behind the houses. Nipper had never been this late before. He shot baskets, he searched the sky, he watched the clock. Cooking smells drifted up to his room. Daylight faded. His mother called, "Palmer, dinner!" He pounded his fist on the windowsill. He kicked the bed. Tears came. He told his parents he had to watch the news for a school project and got permission to take his dinner into his room. But he could not eat. He could not do anything but wait and watch and listen and try to forget how useless watching was. For he knew that no pigeon flies after sundown, and wherever Nipper was, he was there for the night. And where could that be? Had he gotten lost? Had he found another pigeon? Another human friend? Was he roosting warmly in another closet in another town? Or on a road somewhere, crushed, nothing of him moving except a wing waving with every passing tire? Had Panther the yellow cat got a hold of him? He pounded his fists on his thighs and squeaked in frustration. He wanted to do something. But what? What do you do when your pigeon does not come home? He went out to the backyard. He stood in the cold night and looked up and softly called, "Nipper! Nipper!" A world of stars and darkness gave no reply. In the den he whispered to the golden bird, "Where's my pigeon?" The golden bird was silent. He did not go to sleep that night. Instead, sleep sneaked up on him, and the next thing he knew he was dreaming of a tapping, a cruel dream of a pigeon tapping on the window. Only it wasn't a dream, for his room was filled with daylight, pouring under the raised shade, and there was Nipper, pecking at the pane. When Palmer opened the window, Nipper, as usual, hopped onto his head, and bent down and gave his ear an especially ouchy nip, as if to say, "Who said you could wake up without me?" No Christmas morning was ever happier than that one. It was Saturday, so the two could play as long as they wished. Palmer kept the bird in his room until noon. By that time, Nipper was knocking on the window, clearly wanting to go out. Palmer hated to let him go, but he knew he must. As he opened the window and watched Nipper fly off, he knew something else. He could no longer bear this alone. It had to be shared. "Why are you doing this to me?" He dashed down the stairs, out the door, and across the street, coatless, not feeling the cold. He knocked on her door. He pressed the doorbell. Inside, he heard her footsteps, her voice calling, "I'll get it!" The door opened. Warmth and light washed over him. She smiled. She was glad to see him. He did not wait another moment. He said, "I have a pigeon.